You're listening to the Visionary Lifestyle Podcast, the show that's dedicated to raising consciousness and empowering you to activate your highest potential. I'm your host, Magda Freedom Rod. Our guest today is Daniel Stewart. Daniel has been an East West Psychotherapist for 15 years. He's been a co-owner and highly trained yoga teacher at Rising Lotus Yoga since 2006, and he's also a very talented Kirtan Artist. He leads teacher trainings and hosts multiple yoga retreats annually. He's got a lot going on. I first met Daniel when I was providing veganic conscious eating nourishment for his guests at one of his yoga retreats. And I was really struck by his huge open heart and his deep knowledge of yoga and kirtan. So in this interview, we'll dive deep into his psychotherapy background and talk about how it applies to yoga. There are lots of great nuggets in this show, and I hope you find it as inspiring as I do. You can learn more about Daniel at danielstewart.com. Welcome to the show, Daniel Stewart.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for making the time to be here today. I'm so grateful. We've known each other for a little while, and it was really important to me to get your voice on the show. I think you have such a powerful voice for yoga and for wellness and healing. And the first thing I want to do is read the intention on the front of your website because, well, I'm going to start by reading it. You say, "My intention is to help you find your way to express your highest potential and live your most vibrant, authentic life." And I love this so much because it's very much in alignment with my mission and specifically those words, highest potential. For Visionary Lifestyle, my tagline has always been activating your highest potential.
Yeah.
Because it's about affirming that all beings are born with infinite potential, right? And it's my belief that through the use of these tools that we teach, yoga, meditation, and others, we can cultivate and nurture those seeds of greatness to empower specifically the highest expression of that potential in people.
Yes.
Right? What are your thoughts on that?
So important, particularly now it's happening in the world. It's essential. And you said we met, recently. It's true, and we met with you as a chef on retreats that I was doing in Ojai. And of course, what you bring, as you say, is this activating awareness and consciousness about how everything, including food, particularly food, can be a piece of our, holistic mind-body health and the energy and fire that allows this movement toward highest potential. Yeah, so it's essential. I mean, this is the basis of my work. Carl Jung, who was one of my teachers, if you can say that, believed that our self, capital S self, is waiting to unfold, period, and that most of our suffering happens when we are misaligned with this true unfolding. Of course, in the East, that would be our Dharma. And so, yes, that's it. Bring in consciousness. That's it.
Right. And that's what this show is all about, is, activating potential in people and raising consciousness on the planet. So I love talking to like-minded people and helping to expand that conversation, especially for people who may just be kind of checking out this path and moving in this direction. I noticed you said self with a capital S. Can you talk about the difference between the self with the capital S versus the self with the small s?
Sure. I mean, for Jung, this would be the transcendent consciousness that the Buddhists would say it's the one awareness, and in the yogic tradition, you might call it Atman or even Ishvara, the one ultimate reality. And Jung would say the capital S self is the crystal matrix of the actual personality, which is in the unconscious, pushing always forward in a kind of compensatory relationship to the more rigid ego perspective in order to create wholeness and develop real growth. And of course, we could say essentially that, what is the point of any organism, right? To come up against new information and to grow, to integrate that new information with interest and joy that's life force really, in order to come to an integration and of new information and more wholeness. And I think we suffer when that basic human inner guidance is misaligned, and we're misaligned with, or we're missing it, or we're no longer aware that that is what's happening when we do not have a relationship to this deeper self, capital S. Jung called it the Godhead at one point, this God energy. Then we are not whole. There's just a disenfranchised, fragile, overdeveloped, rigid, defended ego often, not related to the unconscious, to the source, to the mystery, to the self, to full awareness, etc.
It reminds me of a children's book that I found years ago at Agape when I was attending there a lot with my daughter when she was little, and we would hang out in the kids section, and they had this great book that was called The Little Me and the Great Me.
Yeah, right.
And it was exactly about this in a very simplified version for children to understand, right?
Well, the basic, yoga, the basic description of yoga is that it's the unification of the opposites, and the fundamental opposites are the individual soul and the universal soul, or individual consciousness and universal consciousness, or the ego and the capital S self, right? So that is the fundamental description, definition of yoga.
Well, that's perfect, because my next question was going to be, how do you define yoga? So we're totally in sync and in alignment right now. That's beautiful. I also wanted to acknowledge how beautiful it is to witness you as you blend all of your interests and talents into such a powerful offering. You have many facets to your being with your music and the kirtan and the psychotherapy and the yoga and the meditation. I mean, it's like this whole package that you bring that's really unique and special. And so moving into the yoga, the conversation of yoga, you've just defined what it is, how you define it. I would love to know how your yoga journey started. How did yoga find you? What was your first introduction to it? What called you to try it?
Well, I would like to say also that there are many ways to define yoga, and one of the fundamental definitions that rests deeply in my heart is, it is a practice, a scientific method to discover how consciousness is being manifest in us. And fundamentally, meditation and yoga, of course, yoga, as we're talking about it now, is not asana. We're talking about the science of yoga, which is a science of reducing suffering and knowing the self. That fundamentally, there is a movement in this practice toward knowing the deeper truth of ourself, aligning with it, as we said, and learning how to be in that, express it. And so seeing yoga as this practice to understand fundamentally that we are an expression of consciousness, and how that consciousness is manifest in us and through us, I think is one of the most important ways that I define yoga. Like, who are we? And you're asking me how yoga showed up in my life. There's a practice called nete nete, which is not that, where if you ask, who am I? You just ask the question, and you can do it right now, and anyone listening can do it right now too. Who am I? Anything that rises as an answer is not us, because if we can witness it or see it, then it is not us. And if you play this deeply enough, if you really sit with this, and this is an ancient technique, you'll start to realize that everything that rises is not who we are. So then we come to a profound understanding that we are a witness. We're the witness. We're awareness itself. And then again, if that's true, yoga is about this question, well, if I'm just awareness, where do I place my awareness? How is awareness showing up in me? What are the patterns of not clear seeing? It's called the vidya, a misperception and ignorance that keep me from knowing this expression of consciousness and not placing it. And so then I'm led around by unconscious patterns rather than conscious patterns. And one way of thinking of yoga is as repetitious conscious patterns, waking up to this moment mindfully, as compared to repetitious unconscious patterns, or samskaras, they're called in the East, right? And so for me, yoga, before I even knew about asana, the practice of yoga as we know it in the West mostly, I was doing some analysis with a Jungian analyst. My father was a Jungian, and my stepmom is a Jungian analyst, and my dad was kind of preeminent in the bringing of some of Jung's work to San Francisco and in the original institute there. And I was pretty sure I would never, if anything ever be a psychotherapist. That was one thing I was sure of. But you see, we never know. The ego thinks we know where we're going, but of course I ended up following in the family after all.
Right.
And I was doing this deep work with the Jungian, and I had a dream about where I saw a woman in a cave in a pose. She was naked with long black hair, and I didn't know the pose. And as I started to explore it, I discovered it was called child's pose. It was the first real experience I'd ever had of seeing an asana pose, and it led me to being curious about this question of what the Eastern traditions of yoga and how they help us transcend suffering. And then I, of course, found that Carl Jung had been very interested in these Eastern traditions, and one could say that most of his theoretical perspective has a lot of the Eastern perspective, the balancing of the opposites, the holding of the tension of the opposites, the transcendence as possible, and I can speak more about that in a moment. But my actual personal introduction to the practice of asana happened after a breakup, and a friend of mine came over and dragged me off my couch and said, hey, you're sitting here and you're feeling depressed. I want to take you to do yoga. And she dragged me to Steve Ross, who taught a very strong class. And I'd never seen any of this. Went into the class, was trembling and sweating profusely in about 5 minutes, and it was miserable for me. Everybody knew what they were doing. I had no idea what this was. At the end, however, I lay down in Shavasana, and I had a very profound inward turning. Something very clear opened, and I knew that this was an essential, this quieting of my egoic consciousness that allowed me to rest more deeply in that moment in my transcendent consciousness, or capital S self, or just, we could say, in my authentic self, in my deeper nature, was profound. And then I knew something really powerful is going on here. And so, of course, I kept going back, and then I took classes where I could slow down and learn the poses, and gradually it became a deep and regular part of my daily practice. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. I love that story, and just that visual of you in the class and like
I
struggling
know.
through it, and
I know.
getting to the Shavasana and just being like, oh,
Yes, exactly.
oh, I get it. And I love witnessing, like when I have new students in my classes and they cry in Shavasana, and they come up to me after and
Exactly.
they say, what's going on? I'm crying. I'm like,
Exactly.
you're doing it right. That means you're doing it right. Something's opening, something's
Right.
expanding. You're reaching higher levels. It's
Yeah.
so beautiful to witness that, and to
Amen.
hear that that's
Yeah.
how it happened for you. That's so cool.
Yeah, and it's really the struggle of the ego. There it is again. It's that small contraction. The Upanishads say that if you take the one transcendent consciousness and contract it, you get ego. So
Huh.
it's this idea of just, can we soften this smaller lens and return again to the seat of our stillness and our peace that's always available. This deep wellspring.
Exactly. It is always available. And that's something that I remind my students of as well. Just like this is one of the many gifts of yoga, is how it trains us, through the practice itself, to return to center, that center that's always available to us anytime, any place. And you can cultivate, strengthen that muscle. And just through, and this is why yoga is called a practice, right? The more we do it, the easier it becomes to just drop into that regardless of what's going on around you.
Sure.
Yeah.
And of
So
course, we know that there are massive physiological and neurobiological changes happening too that allow that to be possible. So, yeah.
Well, sure. Do you want to expand on that briefly?
Sure. Well, we're starting to understand, Western science comes and takes a look at practices that are 4,000 years old and just verifies that they're working. And so starting to understand that things like mindfulness, just basic mindfulness, which of course is returning our awareness and our attention to this moment in an intimate relationship with what is regularly. Gratitude as well, meditation, following the breath, etc., and yoga practice all do a couple of things. One, they shrink the amygdala. They take the fear center down, which is really powerful if you had any trauma. They also grow areas in the frontal lobe that are more associated with things like compassion and making choices. And so reactivity can be limited, so we have that moment where, there's that great cartoon, Far Side, two amoebas, Stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response. And then the other one says, isn't there something else? Well, yes, there is something else. Viktor Frankl says there is this moment of choice where we're slow enough and present enough and aware enough between the stimulus and the response. That's consciousness, that moment where we decide what to do rather than we're dragged forward by a pattern or an unconsciousness. And this happens by changing neurobiology, the way neurons are firing together, the patterns that are being created and sustained by the choices we make with our practices are literally changing the brain and the neurobiology of the body.
Oh, that's so great to have that explanation of, from the scientific perspective. And just what's coming up for me as you're saying this is yoga is a tool to help empower us to respond rather than react to life.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah. To make a choice. I mean, to be conscious. To be conscious. We pull on the chariot's bridle and control the horses of the mind. That's what we hear in the Bhagavad Gita. We're not pulled around unconsciously by the horses moving in all directions, or the monkey mind, another metaphor, right?
Right. So we're behaving more intentionally.
Sure, absolutely. And we're awake. Yeah. We're awake.
Right. It's so good to be awake.
Yeah.
I always say that yoga is the gateway drug to higher consciousness.
Yes, amen.
Whether people realize it or not, sometimes they show up for the physical practice and they get way more than they came for.
That always happens, right? In my experience, right? Anything that gets someone into the room and practicing, I know that there's going to be the possibility of real change, real transformation of consciousness, real transformation of patterns, and returning to a deeper understanding of oneself and less suffering.
Right. Yeah. That's certainly a worthy goal, less suffering. So I'm curious what your favorite part of the practice is personally. Like do you have a personal practice yourself?
Yes, I do. Do you mean out of all yoga practice? Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that among other things, I am a bhakti yogi, and I'm a kirtanwala. And so I find that singing kirtan is a very beautiful blade to cut directly, blade of discernment, or however you want to think about it, directly to a state of blissful awareness. It's one of the faster ways to meditation I discovered. And so I love that practice. I chant every day in the morning. And of course, I lead group kirtan as well. There's just something about, I mean, not to mention, again, the neurobiological, there's an entrainment that happens when we sing together. There's something very powerful. In most cultures that have kind of a well-rounded, I don't know what the right word would be, life, have some kind of public singing and dancing, right? Even Brene Brown talks about this, and so for me, that stilling myself by singing, so quick, so beautiful, so deep, and it's so heart-based. One beautiful definition I heard of, yogas chitta vritti nirodha, right? That means yoga is the cessation of the compulsive fluctuations of the mind. That's a basic description in the Yoga Sutras. And I read a beautiful translation by a woman, I'm forgetting her name, Joy Devi, I think, where she says, yoga is the aligning of consciousness in the heart. Right? So it's this devotional part. It brings, we can have so much going on in our brain. The chitta vritti is this continued repetitive cycle, we could call it neuroses if we want, of waves, thought waves, forms, talking all the time without us being aware of them. And what bhakti yoga, or maybe we could say any yoga, is about is to bring the heart back into alignment. And again, here are the opposites, right? Here's Sita and Ram. Here's the heart and the mind, or the rational and the, I'm going to use the word irrational, but I don't mean irrational in the way most people think. Jung called it the irrational, where we're in the mystery, the aspects of the self where creation is happening, where there's symbolic imagery, mythopoetic imagery, which is not defined or cannot even be defined directly by rational thought, right? Sometimes we think about these ideas of what's really happening when transcendent consciousness is rising. And the more we say the words, I mean, I'm doing it here, I'm using the only tool I have, which is language. we make it smaller, right? We actually make smaller this process by trying to define it. And of course, we have to. But there are things rising, this transcendence is rising. We could say even the God consciousness wanting to be expressed. It doesn't want to be made smaller. It can't be made smaller. There's a Sufi laughter that happens in all the poems, like, oh, you small little beautiful one, still, clinging to the smaller piece. At some point, you'll really understand the spreading of your wings and the opening to this deeper transcendence. I don't know if I strayed off the point, but
No, it's all beautiful. I love. I could listen to you talk all day about this stuff. But let's go into kirtan a little bit since
sure.
you brought that up. I know that you have a background in music, so I'm curious how kirtan started. How did you find that,
Well, believe
or
it
how
or
did it
not, it
find you?
was, I grew up in Berkeley, and so I would see the Hare Krishnas all the time there as a kid, and I did not understand it in any way. In fact, it was a little bit intimidating and a little frightening,
Mm-hmm.
partly because that was the time when, you were never sure whether there was, you'd sit down to someone, they'd invite you to lunch, and it would be a cult.
Right.
I mean, I'm just being honest about what was happening at that time. And then, of course, we see the Hare Krishnas everywhere, and didn't understand I didn't even know who Krishna was as a symbolic, archetypal deity. And then gradually, I was aware of this Hare Krishna movement. But then the real opening for me was, again, I got to give it to Steve Ross.
Hmm.
He chanted. And, really interesting, powerful yogi that, had a, his struggle, like all of ours, is how to be a householder in the midst of being also an ascetic and living a yogic life. And for him, he had a deep, deep practice, and then he would teach, and he would bring little pieces of it in. So little pieces into the room, like a little bit of chanting. But then you'd go on a retreat with him, and then he'd actually do full kirtan. And I just fell in love with it because I loved singing, and I would sing that myself and loved it in his classes. And when I started to teach, I just started to do it at the beginning of my classes and at the end of my classes somewhat too, and just became something that was part of my way of teaching asana. It was
Mm.
a way that I love the music. Of course, as you said, I have a background as a musician, so it's just a natural
Natural
expression from,
progression, right?
yeah. And then I gradually learned more and more about what the actual bhakti yoga tradition means and expresses. And
Mm-hmm.
as a Jungian depth psychotherapist, with an interest in the psyche as it represents these practices of transformation as mythopoetic symbolic imagery, I got fascinated too by the archetypes. We can call all these little guys deities like Ganesha and Shiva and Kali Ma, etc. Or we can also look at them as representations of what's happening in the psyche when we move toward consciousness. You can say, oh, Shiva, Shiva, Shiva Shankara, that Shiva dancing in the ring of the flames of the creation of the universe, and he's standing on the head of a dwarf named Ignorance. And it is exactly what we've already said, you and I, that Shiva as an archetype is a reminder that cycle of misperception has to end. We have to wake again to a moment of the possibility of transcendent consciousness where we stay with the truth rather than these old patterns, and then real growth can happen.
Mm.
So I love that, that one could see these as, I could just understand it as a deity if I'm, Hindi, but I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see it just as a transcendent heart opening, which happens when we sing, but I can also think of it, wow, not only did these yogis discover ways to codify a practice that helped to understand consciousness and develop it, as we said earlier, develop the highest potential. But they also discovered mythopoetic ways of describing it symbolically that were so powerful, like Sita and Ram. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Carl Jung, his whole story is that in the end there's a divine intermarriage called the conjunctio, right, where the wholeness is these two opposites coming together, and he could see that as ego and the unconscious, or ego and self. And of course, here it is, Sitan Ram. It is exactly that. And so, how beautiful, right? When you see,
Mm-hmm.
I have a synthetic approach. I start to see all the interconnectedness between these practices, all really saying the same thing in different ways.
Right, right. It all comes down to that. So it's great hearing from you what kirtan means to you and what it's about, because I'll share with you that for a long time, I really resisted kirtan and any sort of chanting or mantra. And I think, like, as you mentioned with the Hare Krishnas, you were maybe a little bit intimidated. And I think that was my response as well, is I didn't understand it. And I didn't want to be just a sheep following blindly and repeating these things that I didn't understand.
Yeah.
And I notice often that in these situations, the mantras are not translated and they're not explained. So I would sit in maybe a Kundalini class that would have chanting, or try to go to a kirtan and just feel like not comfortable participating, because our voice is powerful and we're invoking something with these words, but I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So it's helpful, I think, to have a deeper understanding of the translation of the mantras, and just that little explanation that you just gave. I think is really helpful, and I would like to encourage people to understand that better, to move in that direction, because once you finally get into it, like I had a transformational moment at Bhakti Fest probably 5 years ago, maybe at 2 a.m. with Jai Uttal singing Hare Krishna for what seemed like hours, right? And the levels going up and down and fast and slow, and it really takes you on a journey. And I remember very clearly, it was such a powerful moment when I finally got it, and my heart finally got into that open space, and that magic and that healing and that transformation happens. So it does happen. And what makes it so healing and transformational?
Well, it's interesting. I'm hearing you talk about, the contraction that our ego has about things that are new or that they don't understand, right? And I spoke a little bit about that. And so we have to know that that's a mantra too, right? So there tends to be, because the mind, if we talk about meditation and transformation, mind has a negative bias. It's looking sometimes for danger, right? We're survivors. And so we're contracting against something, like in this case, these Sanskrit. We don't know what they mean. It's a different language. It's a language that was never even used for conversation. It was only used to talk about spirituality and yoga. And so we're resisting already there, maybe contraction, and then what is really being said. And, if I chant that, does that mean I'm going to walk out of here and suddenly go to Daniel's ATM and put a lot of money in his bank account? Is he somehow tricking me? And, I play like this in class all the time because I know people are feeling this way. I know that there's a bit of a contraction. And so think about what's happening in any contraction. There is a repetitive mantra going on in your brain that something's not okay. So, and we don't even hear it. I mean, most of the time there's a repetitive, it's almost like having Rush Limbaugh on very quiet all the time, this constant kind of perseverative checking out. Is it okay? Is this okay? Am I safe? What is that? Okay, so what we're saying is, well, could we replace that mantra with other more positive mantras, like even I'm okay. If I get my mind quiet enough, I can feel something that's blissful. Can I notice those repetitive patterns? And so one of the ways that kirtan works is we could honestly, now this is not what a traditional kirtan wala would say, we could be singing row, row, row your boat. Mm-hmm. And if that was done devotionally and repetitively, the mind gets quiet enough, there's an experience of real bliss called bhava, this bhakti, this bhava. But of course, the yogis would say, by the way, this is what is believed about Hebrew too, that the words themselves are made of symbols that have meaning and have energy. Now we're going to get really into this, like, whoa, for a minute, because according to physicists, all we are is energy. All we are is vibration and sound, really. So we could be very interested in, well, so are you saying that I'm not a noun, I'm a verb. I'm always in motion. I'm atomic energy in constant motion. I'm not Daniel, I'm Danieling. Mm-hmm. I can never be steady. And so what we're saying is, if a group of us who are vibrating get together and sing these mantras, which over years have had great meaning to many people and speak directly about the transformation of consciousness and are mythopoetic representations in themselves of the process we're all trying to live and explore, which is how to be free, to be myself fully, and to transcend these limitations, most of which are in my mind. And then we have an in-training experience of all singing together, and we hear the vibrations and feel the vibrations, all of that has a great impact on the nervous system and on the psyche. And then the basis of yoga, again, yoga is chitta vritti nirodha. When the mind is quiet enough, something else rises. And according to the Buddhists, it's bliss. Bliss indivisible, right? The sheath of the body in yoga, we get down to the bliss sheath, right? There's the physical sheath, there's the food, they call it the food sheath, the mental sheath, the pranic sheath, the mental sheath, the wisdom sheath, and the bliss sheath. And the bliss sheath is directly connected to Atman or Purusha, which is this, again, universal expression of capital S self, where the vibration is bliss. Joy is our birthright when we can get our mind and that constant negative mantra I was mentioning out of the way. Yeah.
So the kirtan is a tool
Oh, it's a
that.
practice of being. So I guess yes, it's a tool, but it's the thing about yoga is you can't really do it. It is a state of consciousness, and these practices help us. Like you said, you had a transcendent experience, ecstatic experience, a numinous experience, however you want to say, with Jai at Bhakti Fest. These practices help us to be in yoga, help us to discover our authentic nature of more harmonic balance and yoga. Yoga, again, the balance of the opposites. There's a sattvic state of being which is holding the opposites more harmonically, and that's what we're working toward as yogis, but also as depth psychologists, and fill in the blank. Again, all these practices leading to the same place.
Right. So many paths to the one heart center.
Yeah.
So,
consciousness. Yeah.
So as going back into psychology a little bit, what exactly is yoga psychology and philosophy, and how do you integrate that into your teachings?
Well, that's a big question. Again, I'm thinking always that most of these traditions are talking about the same thing, that there is an expression of consciousness that is waiting to be manifest, and that certain patterns or ways of being or misunderstandings keep that from happening. Certain could be neurotic patterns. So yoga psychology, I think that people don't understand is that yoga is a psychology, right? It is a science of the mind that defines exactly what it doesn't say, look, you have to do it this way, this is the map. It says, look, here's a recipe, and if you do this regularly, your consciousness will change, and that change will be that you'll be rediscovering and realigning with your most authentic self, with the truth, with your dharma, and that can only lead to your highest expression of self.
Beautiful. And I imagine with your psychology training and background, it brings something really special to your yoga teaching. Different than other yoga teachers that don't have that background, because you can connect the dots on another level.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if it's special or not, but I do feel like I have a lot of different lenses. And, yoga psychology basically says, that it's the lens, but the only thing we can ever transform is our perception, our consciousness, right? You're not going to change anything other than how we're seeing. Now, that doesn't mean I can't go over to the window and clean it. I mean that in this basic idea of what's happening internally, we start to realize, oh my God, the actual suffering is based on the way my thoughts are, the patterns that I have that are unconscious. And of course, this is the same thing as Western psychology, or at least depth psychology. Depth psychology believes that everything we need to discover our wholeness is already within our psyche, and it needs to be expressed. Like Rumi says, we're trying to take away the things that are in the way of love, not particularly learn just how to love. Same thing with yoga and depth psychology. We're removing that which is not true gradually until the truth shines, right? We're removing patterns and neuroses, ways of being, etc. And the foundation of both of these practices, you asked me about how I see them, how yoga psychology and or philosophy relates directly to Western depth psychology. Again, thousands of years ago, we can imagine these rishis sitting around saying, hey, who am I? What is this? How do I discover myself more fully and align with that and be that? And when I'm most full, wow, I am kind of like God consciousness. It's the highest being expressed. Oh, that's fascinating.
Mm.
And then they started to feel this balance of the opposites, right? And there are lots of ways we can talk about it. They talk about the gunas, tamas, sattva, and rajas. And of course, there are only two, really. And the sattva is the balance center. And so one way of thinking about what's happening in a yoga practice, it could be in your pose, or really it's in your consciousness, your psychology. This is yoga psychology, where we recognize I am repeatedly moving away from the truth because there's some part of me that thinks it's not going to be okay. And that the first repetitive pattern I have is this moving away, this unconsciousness. And then the second repetitive pattern is, when I see it, is that I am turning away from the only place that I will know myself and grow. Right? And so we start to realize, oh, I have to hold, instead of this pattern of, this feels hot. In yoga psychology, it's tapas, svajaya, and ishvara pranadhan. This is Kriya Yoga. This is the yoga of actual change, yoga of action, where we feel, here's the heat. Okay, I'm not turning away. My normal pattern would be to contract against this. So I'm going to open back up and lean into it, because, of course, we know comfort zone. Nobody grows in a comfort zone, right?
Right.
Or, you don't learn how to sail a ship in port. Good sailors are made on massive oceans. And so we choose to lean into this consciously. Now, so this is the ego working to develop the self, right? The ego's like, I get it. This is where my normal pattern would be to move away or to contract. I'm going to stay with this. And then, so that's the tapas, this earnest transformational heat, that when we see anything, like, oh my God, there's something that I have not mentioned to my partner that I have to say. And I don't want to even look at it. So that's a psychological experience of it. It could be in your hip when you're standing in the pose. Svajaya then is the self-study. We just stay with it. And interest is part of this. We stay, we bring discernment, which is one of the main tools of the yogi, and of psychology, to be interested. When there's interest in psychotherapy, it's one of the main indicators of successful psychotherapy. When there's continued interest. Now, what is that? What is that feeling? Why do I want to turn away from it? And so then the third piece of this real transformational yoga, Kriya Yoga, yoga of action, of real change, is the surrender back to the truth, right? Ishvara is this ultimate reality, and pranadhan means to surrender. So I'm leaning in. The practice is I keep showing up. Practice and non-attachment. Those are the two opposites again in yoga. I'm leaning in, showing up, feeling this. Now I'm getting aware of it. What is it? Oh, look at the pattern. Oh my God. And then, of course, people like Pema Chodron say, how delightful when we see our patterns, because once we see them, even if they're embarrassing or we don't like them or they bring shame or we don't want to see who we are, once we see them, we can really transform them. And so the surrender is, there's a process happening here, like Carl Jung would say, and now we're back to depth psychology. There's a process of unfolding that if we keep staying present, keep bringing our ship closer to the wind, keep moving toward that North Star of that inner experience, that wholeness will manifest itself. We don't even have to do anything. Right? It will reach out to us. The unconscious will be our partner as we go forward. The divine expression will be our partner and wants to be our partner. And so that's the surrender piece. Now, the way Jung talks about this, one of his main ideas is called the transcendent function. That we come up against a place where what we're doing is no longer possible. The way we are, our limited understanding of consciousness, our overdeveloped ego perspective, our pattern, is not working for us anymore. It's like we're a lobster, or a little spiny lobster who's grown into our shell, and we have to break that shell open, and there's so much pain. But the new way is not manifest, right? And this could be, again, a way of seeing it, the opposites. I'm moving toward this higher transcendence. It's not clear what to do. I'm stuck in this old pattern. I don't know how to let it go. Jung would say we could also see it as ego and unconscious as the two opposites, but any two opposites. He says you just have to stand there with great consciousness. He's going to say the same thing that Yogi said. You have to bring discernment and interest. You have to sit with, oh my God, this is what's happening. This is what I'm doing. This is what is being called for. and I'm not sure I'm ready for that, or I don't even see it. And he believed fundamentally, if you stay in that heat of the stuckness, and we've all had this moment where I'm just fundamentally stuck, I don't see the way forward.
Mm-hmm.
He believed fully, just as the yogis did, that if you stayed with that consciously, held the transcendence, which is again the Kriya Yoga, holding this heat, there would be a new birth from the unconscious, a compensatory new way that would rise, and it would be so clear when it came that that was the way.
Mm.
Now, we could
Yeah,
talk up,
like,
yes, an expression of the truth, again, not us doing it, waiting for the creation to come, and then Psyche delivers the wholeness. Now, if we resist that, then there's more suffering, right?
right.
Right.
Resistance equals suffering.
Yeah, because we have to be with that truth, particularly, as I said, in this day and age when there's so much dissembling and not standing with the truth, right? It's really so important.
Right. Well, on that note, in the state of the world, you know, I know that part of your work is about the reduction of suffering and depression and anxiety, and just taking a look at the state of the world where we are now, and maybe some people being feeling those things, the suffering, the
Yeah,
depression and
yeah,
anxiety over maybe election results or
yeah.
other things happening in the world. So is there a simple practice that you would recommend for people to help, you know, process that suffering and depression and anxiety?
Well, first, I'd like to respond in a little bit different way, if I could.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the miracle of these practices, once we understand it, once the ego surrenders, we realize that the way through is to stay awake and to turn toward whatever seems difficult, right? I mean, there's this basic idea that my teachers are the things that I need to be with, in full relationship with. Another way to say what yoga and depth psychology about is, can I be in relationship? Fundamentally, it's a sine qua non of all consciousness. Jung said consciousness only comes in a relationship, an active, alive relationship to self, to God, to someone else, whatever. And so the tendency when things are difficult in the world, as they are right now, is to just turn back to our avoidant patterns, or to turn away, right? To not see. The thing about depth psychology and yoga is, oh my God, of course, we need to have this moment of being in the transcendent function where the shadow, and this is another piece of work that depth psychology presents, is we look at the shadow material that we have not yet been ready to embrace into ego consciousness, and we integrate it. And so we see the shadow rising everywhere. Now that can be terrifying as a political person in a democracy, or as a if you're from Syria and just yesterday the borders were actually closed. It's insane, right? Okay. But if we look at it in the larger perspective, like this is one big psyche, it's so important to recognize that this process actually works. What I mean is, if we can not turn away from the shadow, we can really see, well, how am I like that? Wow, what can I do so that whatever it is that I'm seeing, that is, how am I closing my borders? How do I close my borders to my beloved? How am I closing my borders in my daily practices? How am I, and so working on our own, inner consciousness too, but then seeing as a larger meta statement, how fantastic that when there's an infection, when the boil breaks and we get it all out, how amazing. Now, believe me, I feel anxious and afraid about what's happening in the world too, and it's discouraging to me. But I fundamentally believe that if we stay present, if we practice yoga or depth psychology, which means I stay woke. What's that hashtag that's going around right now? Stay woke. Stay woke. And for me, the hashtag is stay woke until everyone else is, right? That's the Buddha idea, that
Mm-hmm.
we rise to consciousness by staying conscious and talking about it and standing up. Open-hearted, love with action, right, is what Gandhi did. So we don't turn
Mm-hmm.
away. We speak what's happening. We say, gosh, this is...
Yeah.
And I fundamentally believe that out of this process, if we stay with it, there will always be growth toward consciousness. That's the whole story.
Right. So looking at the macrocosm of what's
Yeah,
happening in the world as a reflection of the microcosm
yeah,
of, you know, it's a reflection of what's happening within us individually, and
right.
how can we reflect and look at ourselves of how, you know, the things that we witness outside of ourselves that we don't like, how can we recognize those things in ourselves and heal that within ourselves, and through that we heal the world.
Right,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just that simple, although Carl Jung and the yogis both said, this is the one psyche you can change. And if you change it, you can be a bright light. Your soul can be a bright light that changes the world. There's no question about that. But also, there is a collection of psyches. It's called society.
Right.
And some psyches are not working on themselves. And somehow at this time, an unvetted, unwell psyche was elected as our president. And it's not enough to just do our inner work and go inside, though that's essential. I think at a time like this, we have to actually, what are the three refuges of the Buddha? The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Sangha is the community where we link arms and say, no, there is action that's necessary, not just this beautiful yoga psychology, depth psychology, the working on the inner experience, cleaning our own lens, working our own shadow material, getting as clear as possible, living as aligned as possible with our highest expression of divine truth. But also at times like these, when 4 million women marched around the country, and that was essential. Now, that's an expression of psyche. Those psyches came together and needed to express it in that way. Okay, so I'm saying love with action.
Right. Oh, I so appreciate you making that point. This is what has always been the crux of visionary lifestyle, is that perspective of visioning the better world, visioning the world that we want, doing our personal work so that we're operating at the highest frequency possible, fine-tuning our own instrument, but then also taking action outside in the world to create the change that we say that we want, recognizing that sitting in a cave in meditation is not enough if we want the world to change. So thank you so much for bringing that point home.
Amen. Sitting in a cave and meditating is essential to get still enough to contact, I've been saying, inaugurate your inner leader. There is transformational, transcendent, moral principles that are humanistic across all culture that we can rediscover by being quiet. And then we just align with that and we move toward that,
Absolutely.
And that nonviolence and honesty being two of the first, that are so essential.
Right. And so ahimsa, right? We're talking about ahimsa.
Yes, of course. And such exactly. Non-harming.
Right. Toward self, toward others.
Toward, anyone, anything.
Right. Ahimsa is a foundational principle of my conscious eating program, because,
Yes,
food choices are a place that we can, it can be medicine or poison, both for yourself or for the planet. So I love bringing awareness to that. What are your thoughts in terms of food choices as on the yogic path, and are they a factor in awakening consciousness?
Absolutely, everything is a factor of awakening consciousness if we stay present and mindful and in the moment. Food is energy, and really, honestly, it's the energy of the sun, and we can't get it directly, so we get it through sources on the planet. The closer to the sun, the healthier we are. Meaning, if I'm eating fresh vegetables and fruits that have just taking that sunlight in and photosynthesizing, and we're getting that energy more clearly. And of course, we can call this prana, we can call it chi also. And so, yes, how we eat, and not only the food, the choices of what kind of food, but the relationship. Like, there's a sacred relationship that's possible with everything. And this is, I think, what yoga and depth psychology both say. There is a numinous expression. If I eat the food with this awareness, and this comes back to the ego being aware of the work it's doing to build consciousness rather than just running off somewhere, we can eat in a prayerful way, right? We can be conscious and praise all the time. And so being with the food, there are lots of studies that suggest the way we acknowledge the food, the gratitude, the experience of it, being with it, changes the way we use the nutrition. And so again, relationship, consciousness, it's really all the same thing. And I love what you're doing with food, and I love the way you're talking about this visionary lifestyle. And for me, there's a self at the center, and then there's a big wheel with spokes, and every spoke has to be connected to the self. That would be the body, that would be the psyche, that would be our energy, that would be what we eat, that would be our relationships. Everything has to be in a sacred relationship to this deeper expression. of the truth, of the divine sacredness of our own consciousness. I mean, it's pretty much a miracle if we get quiet enough and recognize that we are alive and that consciousness is expressing through us. What a gift.
Amen. Amen. And is that awareness part of your personal practice? Like, how do you start your
Yeah,
day? How do you
yeah,
wake up in the morning? What does
yeah.
your first few moments of your day look like, or your morning practice or routine?
Well, I think again, the main thing I'd like to say about practice is it's this, if we can get the change in perspective and remember this somehow, that my work is to stay aligned with the deeper expression of consciousness or God consciousness or self or source, and that that's actually my work, then all the practices are about that. When I forget that, I feel isolated and alone and confused. But when I wake, I try to first remember with gratitude this peace.
Hmm.
Like, what is it that's needing to be expressed? What is it? What am I in service of in terms of expressing my highest potential? And at this time, the highest potential of our whole culture, right?
Hmm.
And then I do some journaling, which is essential for me. I chant,
Hmm.
and then I meditate for a while. And then I try to get some exercise in because that book is important too.
Hmm.
But for me, it's this mindful, and even when I get on the mat, it's the same idea when I practice asana, I'm just remembering that all of this is a practice and a process of getting my ego aligned with that which wants to transcend the smallness of my situation or my awareness or
Hmm.
my ego consciousness, and that's my work. And in fact, Carl Jung had this extraordinary moment on the savannah where he had a lot of doubt about some of his work. He had some deep dark seas journey where he had his own splits and depression and went inward, and he used the material he discovered there so beautifully and profoundly. And he was standing on the savannah and thinking, well, what if I was the primordial man? What if I was the only man here? And what is going on here? And he had this really clear idea that we've already talked about, that there is the physicists would say, there's an atomic field. I meditate to be back in touch with the atomic field. And then we've all risen from that field, but Shiva will take us back at the end, right? And so Jung would say there's the self, same thing, and that the ego rises from that self. And the ego finds wholeness when it turns back to a relationship with the self. That this wholeness it needs to be relativized. The ego needs to know, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm paying attention to the deeper wellspring of creation so that can be expressed and consciousness can rise. But then he asks a separate question. So what is that one source? What is the self? What is God consciousness wanting? So imagine God consciousness or self or source or Ishvara only. There's no relationship. So the self needs to split itself off to be known. Jung had this extraordinary idea. The dance, the lila that the Sufis talk about, this dance between the individual and God consciousness, that's it. The ego turning back toward the source to feel wholeness, but the source splitting off these souls over and over again. Of course, I'm talking mythopoetically, over and over again so that it can be reflected, so that its creation can move through us. So it's extraordinary expression of the sacred. And all creation, everything that we know here comes from this dance of fantasy and the unconscious and the deeper wellspring, that's what Source does. Splits off another bright light that it can dance with so that there is wholeness again. And of course now we're back to Sita and Ram and the divine intermarriage, and I could go on forever on that mythopoetic journey.
Yeah, I could talk to you all day about all of this. Like I said earlier, I wanna wrap it up with one last question.
Yeah.
I'm always making the effort to help people move from me consciousness to we consciousness. Really believing that it's my belief that this is needs to be our mindset going forward as we're on a planet of 7 billion people, soon to be 11 billion. We have to consider outside of ourselves if we're going to survive as a species on this planet, and hopefully raise consciousness and do it and not only survive but thrive. So the question I like to ask people for more of the global perspective is, what is your wish for the world?
Oh my God, so easy to say. It would be the wish of Carl Jung's wish, it would be the wish of the yogis that consciousness can continue to be manifest, that we continue to bring light into the darkness, that we continue to remove suffering and ignorance over and over again. We continue to bridge the gaps of misperception, that we literally bring the sun of consciousness up every day. That's it, that we get more and more conscious until we actually recognize that we are all in this together, that we can't stand on one side of this big beautiful boat and say, hey, there's a hole over on your side. We are in this together in such a profound way. And so for me, it's back to what we're talking about. Carl Jung was very clear during the First and Second World War. He says, I don't know whether consciousness or the unconscious will win out. And we're just a species. Species come and go. But if we can be conscious and bring consciousness and change our consciousness, and that consciousness can touch someone else, and then conscious children, etc., then this species has a chance. Then we're all recognizing the truth that we are all one in this deeper transcendent space.
Yes, and would you say that these tools that we've been talking about today, the yoga, the meditation, the kirtan, all of this are tools for awakening that consciousness?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Meditation itself is just sitting still long enough to notice that there is an awareness we can be in touch with that is our transcendence, right? That there is one awareness. It's quite startling when we recognize that ego consciousness is just this little floating island on the top of something sacred and divine and transcendent. Again, these are just words I'm trying to use in my little rational brain to describe something mysterious and profound.
Right. Beautiful. Amen. I'm with you 100%. Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for taking the time to talk with us today.
What a joy.
Share your wisdom.
What a pleasure.
I have such a deep respect for you and the gifts that you're bringing to the world. So I just want to say thank you for your yes to show up the way that you do.
Thank you so much. And I loved this, and I hope you'll invite me again so we can deepen some of these questions and explore more.
Absolutely. I would love that. Thank you so much. Namaste.
My pleasure. Namaste.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Conscious Eating 101 e-course. This is a 6-week online course aimed at empowering you to make food choices that are in alignment with your values. The program is based on ahimsa, also known as non-harm, and helps you make every bite that you take an expression of love, self-love, animal love, and planet love. The course offers 15 lessons and 20 nutritious and delicious recipes and is offered over 6 weeks that you can do at your own pace. It includes lessons like plant-based nutrition, protein, dairy alternatives, the story on sugar, GMOs, label reading, and many more. If you're looking to increase your health and happiness, balance your weight, reduce your footprint on the planet, and align your food choices with your values, or are interested in being part of the solution to huge world problems like climate change, rainforest destruction, and world hunger, then this is the course for you. If this speaks to you, please check out consciouseating101.com today. Thanks so much for answering the call to be here today. If you found the show in any way empowering or inspiring, I would be so grateful if you would write a review in iTunes. This is really the best way to help support the show and to help us get noticed by others who are looking for the kind of content that we're sharing. You can also support the show with a small monthly donation on Patreon. Go there and check out our perks at patreon.com/visionary lifestyle. Namaste.